Arjun's first sight of London was a smear of grey, rain-washed streets and the soft, distant wail of sirens. The kind of welcome that feels like a warning and a promise at the same time. He had left home 3 months earlier, the heat of his Indian summer still in his bones, a small black backpack slung over one shoulder and a head full of plans. He was 19, bright with scholarship pride, and hungry for the strange kind of independence only a foreign campus could offer. He'd been assigned a place at Rosewood Hall, a university-run student hostel tucked into a narrow lane of Victorian brick houses. On paper, it sounded almost quaint. Shared kitchen, courtyard, the strictest of quiet hours. In practice, the building was older than any of the brochures and smelled faintly of damp and old books. On the day he arrived, the receptionist, a woman with too much makeup and an unimpressed expression, handed him a key and gave directions like a kind of ritual. No guests after 11. Quiet hours start 7. Do not tamper with the boilers. There's a curfew. She paused as if considering whether to add something else, then shrugged. Rosewood's been around a while. You'll get used to it. Arjun laughed politely. He did not get used to it. His room was small and leaned toward the courtyard. It was furnished with a narrow bed, a desk, and a wardrobe whose wood had a history of creaks. The other students in his corridor were mostly in their first year too, strangers who smiled politely on the stairs and who called each other by first names in a language that sounded like a film soundtrack to Arjun now and then. Sam, Maya, Daniel, Leo, Hannah. The students were friendly enough. They were polite to the point of ritual. They exchanged nods and pre-planned weekend plans. They were, in one peculiar and unspoken way, the same. It was Leo who told him on the second night that everyone in the hostel slept at 8. 8? Arjun blinked. That's early. Leo grinned like it was a joke, but his eyes were too flat. We're all up early. Labs, courses. 8 o'clock. Lights out, headphones off. You'll get used to it. Doesn't anyone stay up? Read? Work? Arjun asked. Leo shrugged. You don't ask. You just go to bed. That same evening, Arjun watched them. At 7:50, Sam closed his laptop and put it away. Maya straightened her duvet with deliberate calm. Daniel turned off his lamp and lay on his back staring at the ceiling, eyes open for a brief, slow minute, and then he blinked once, closed them, exhaled, and everything around him softened as though someone had lowered a curtain. By 8 p.m., there was an almost palpable hush. The corridor, normally a tumble of backpacks and mugs, became a museum of sleeping bodies. It made Arjun uncomfortable. He was a night person by nature. His best work happened after midnight. The first night he stayed awake, turning pages and clicking through slides and listening to the muffled city outside. At 8 p.m. he felt utterly alone. At 8:12 he heard the sound for the first time. It was not a noise in the ordinary sense. It was the empty hang of sound when a long place held its breath. It began as a faint, distant thudding, like wood swelling in cold weather. And threaded through it was something else, an inhalation that sounded almost like a whispering human choir. It came from somewhere above them and below them at once, an odd geometry of echo. Arjun's first impulse was to be practical. The pipes, he told himself. The radiator. Ghosts weren't in any of his engineering lectures. It built into a rhythm, slow, patient in a way that made his scalp go tight. The corridor seemed to listen too. Even the city beyond the courtyard went quiet, as if Rosewood held its breath and drew the world into the hush. He stood up. The lights were already dim in the common room. He found Sam by the sink. Night 2 began differently. He tried to be clever. He ate late, drank black tea, planned to stay awake. At 7:45, his floor grew still. At 7:58, the nearest door creaked, and then one by one, the hallway dimmed like a practiced scene change. Doors side closed, sneakers stopped. By 8 the building seemed to have fallen under a rule. Even the clock on the kitchen microwave lost its bright numbers to shadow. At 8:13, the thudding came again. This time it carried a small human sound, the rustle of fabric as someone moved. The sound shivered through the building like a current. Arjun's heart beat against the walls of his chest. A half-hearted laughter rose in him and then fell apart. He looked at his phone. No one had texted. No one had opened a window. The night deepened its teeth into the hostel. He watched as the door opposite him, room 11 Daniels, shifted. The gap between the door and the frame widened a centimeter, and something small and narrow slipped under. A shadow like a fingernail. The shadow lengthened, a smear of sable that crawled like spilled ink across the parquet. Daniel remained still, breathing even and slow beneath the covers. The dark spread like an oil stain until it met the bed, and for a heartbeat Arjun felt the hair on his skin stand. The shadow paused. The thin scent of dust entered the room, then the metallic, faintly sweet smell of iron. Daniel's mouth formed a small O like a child dreaming. The shadow crept up the side of his face as if to read something on his cheek. A caress without warmth. Arjun, without fully understanding why or how, stood. He crossed the room and touched Daniel's arm. The student did not stir. A ridiculous, irrational thought popped into his head and lodged there. Pray. He could not pray properly. His English was too raw for prayer in that stiff new syntax, but the words of the Hanuman Chalisa had lodged in him since childhood, like a talisman down his throat. He had recited it once when he was 8 and scared of thunder. The words were simple, ritual. They were a way of breathing against fear. He began softly to murmur. At first it was a hum between his teeth, a childlike ritual. He did not know the words in perfect hour-by-hour order. He had to remember the rhythms, the cadences of something learned in a temple doorway, in a rush of childhood summers. Jai Hanuman Gyan Gun Sagar. The syllables felt like a key. Something changed. The dark at Daniel's throat trembled. It was as if the shadow had ears. The shadow drew back like a tide and then pooled. A smear, uncertain. The air shifted. Daniel's eyelids fluttered half open. He blinked like a man surfacing from a deep sleep, and then smiled without quite recognizing his own face. The metallic odor washed away. The building exhaled. Arjun stopped mid-line. The half-remembered mantra had felt absurd, like an echo of a life he was trying not to be anymore. But Daniel was awake and looking at him with gratitude and confusion. "You were sleepwalking?" Arjun suggested lamely. Daniel frowned. "I don't know. I had a dream. Weird." He rubbed his face and turned off the bedside lamp. The corridor went obediently quiet again. Arjun lay back down with the mantra tasting like pennies in his throat. That night he slept for a few hours, a scattered, uneasy thing. When he woke, the sky was a wash of thin white, and the world behaved like a normal world again. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself 100 things. On the second day, whispers followed him. A girl in the library, Maya, met his eyes and went pale when he glanced her way. She hurried past him into the cafe and sat with her hands over her cup. Later, Leo touched his arm briefly in the corridor and said, under his breath, "Don't say it. Not here." He had until then assumed the hostel was a place like any other. The weird sleep. At 1:13 a.m., Daniel woke pale and hollow-eyed. He vomited quietly in the bathroom and then slept like a baby until the morning. He told people he had a drunk dream. They accepted the explanation because they liked their explanations tidy. Arjun kept going with the Chalisa in bits and pieces over the days. Each time he read, the shadows recoiled and their voice thinned. Each time he paused, the darkness gathered courage and the building sighed as if the floorboards had been pressed by unseen feet. On the morning of the third day, the campus email sent an advisory: noise complaint from neighbors. Please observe quiet hours. The message looked ordinary and blank as a white page, but in Arjun's chest it was an elevator descending. That night he felt the change in the air, like the moment before a storm when birds stop singing and the world hushes down as if listening for thunder. At 7:30, there was a knock at his door. It was Maya. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Leo hovered at her shoulder. "We're going to the chapel," she said. The English in her voice was brittle and urgent. "Pastor Mark, he says he can bless places. He'll come." Arjun felt a small flare of irritation. He had not asked for religion to be westernized in emergency kits. But the chapel was a safe place for noise, for communal voice. He wrapped the printed Chalisa in cloth and followed. The chapel was a small, squat room with stone walls that smelled of old wax. Pastor Mark looked halfway between a teenager and an anchor. He listened, palms steepled. People sat in the wooden benches like a jury. Daisy with a bandaged finger, Sam with a bruise near his jaw he explained away as sport. Two other students who refused to be named. Their faces were pale. Their eyes looked like animals that had been watched. Pastor Mark spoke in an unflustered voice. "We'll pray in the way we know. Candle, salt, and words." He set down an old Bible and lit a candle whose flame shivered as if the air had been listening. He asked if anyone wanted to say something. The crowd made the correct noises. Arjun felt like an extra chord in a song that was about to change key. It was Daniel who stood up then. His voice was thin but clean. I had a face in my room. It was like cold glass. He glanced at Arjun, and the two of them exchanged an odd, private glance. An acknowledgement. Daniel's hand shook. And there are rules. The hostel keeps its hours. We don't talk about young men sleeping at 8. If you don't follow the rule, it gets angrier. Angrier? Daisy asked. She sounded like someone who had once been brave for a living and discovered that bravery sometimes retired. Daniel nodded. It whispers names. It takes someone who is alone and sits with them. It likes to watch people fall asleep alone. Arjun thought of the shadow sifting across Daniel's cheek. For a second he imagined all the small nights of the world and how many things crept out of the corners of them. They prayed. Pastor Mark read a prayer. He sprinkled salt and said something in Latin that sounded like a key turning. The candles bobbed. For the rest of that night, the hostel was quieter than it had been in days. People stayed together in groups, in small knots of mattresses and blankets in the common room. They watched each other as if eyes could be the shape of a lock. It did not last. At 11:43 p.m., there was a scream that skinned the night raw. It came from the 3rd floor. It was not sharp like a human cry, but a long, layered thing that won't be mended by time. People ran. Arjun ran too, up the stairs 2 at a time. The corridor smelled like rotten fruit and the metallic copper scent of panic. In room 18, marked on the outside with a faded sticker of a cartoon planet, sat Mia. She had been a quiet student, always reading by the window until the day she stopped coming to tutorials. The door was ajar. Inside the room was tossed like something had tried to solve a puzzle by pulling at all the pieces at once. Books were scattered. The chair lay on its side. Mia sat on the bed with her hair matted, eyes huge and black as if someone had taken the light out of them. She smiled like a person who has learned a joke without the punchline. She was fine, someone said. She was in the kitchen, then the scream. Mia spoke in a voice that split on the edges. "He's under the bed," she whispered. "He's in the walls. He likes the quiet." She laughed then, a long, thin sound, and shifted like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. Her hand reached for Arjun's sleeve, and with a force that was not entirely her own, she scratched the skin on his arm with a series of neat, shallow lines. He felt the teeth of them. She whispered the names of 3 people who had been gone for years. Names from the university's alumni board. Names that no one on that